Today, we step into the damp corridors of England in 1905, a land of smoke-choked factories, clipped manors, and a rising faith in the miracle of science. On the edge of a wind-beaten, more squatted Blackthorn Asylum, its towers crouched like sentinels against the sky. Inside its barred windows, patients muttered into the dark, their words swallowed by brick and padded walls. Official reports spoke of progress, of cures, of order, but the walls themselves told another story. Attendants whispered of locked doors swinging open, of patients chanting in unison, of shadows moving where no shadows should be. And always, always, the voices, soft, untraceable, repeating names no one had spoken aloud. They called it madness. They called it delusion. But those who worked within Blackthorn carried another suspicion, that the voices weren't echoing from inside the patients' heads, but from the asylum itself. It begins, as too many stories in asylums do, with a sound that shouldn't exist. In the winter of 1905, attendants at Blackthorn Asylum swore they heard voices echoing through the east wing after midnight, but not patients' voices. These were different, soft, deliberate, almost rehearsed, a whispering chorus, spoken in unison, that seemed to come from behind locked, empty rooms. One nurse claimed she heard her own name being called. Not shouted, not spoken, but breathed directly into her ear while she was alone with her lamp. Another said she found a diary beneath the patient's cot, its pages smeared with ink and blood, describing conversations with the men behind the walls. When questioned, the patient screamed until his jaw dislocated, insisting he had never seen the book before. The asylum director dismissed it as hysteria, the natural product of sleepless nights and overworked minds. Yet, within a month, 3 staff members quit, 1 vanished entirely, and a patient, silent for years, spoke one final sentence before hanging himself with his bed sheets. They said the doctor belongs to them now. The words were scribbled in the incident log, circled twice, then buried under decades of dust. Blackthorn was never demolished. It shall still stand to the edge of a barren English moor, swallowed by ivy, watched by no one, visited only by teenagers daring each other to peer through the broken windows. Most who pass by laugh at the legends, shadows in the hallways, whispers in the vents, faces pressed against shattered glass. But buried beneath ghost stories is something far stranger, a chain of testimonies, records, and silence reports that point not just to madness, but as something meticulously concealed. The tragedy of 1905 isn't remembered for a body count. No famous killer, no escaped lunatic running wild. Instead, it lingers like a rotten taste. The suspicion that the asylum itself, its corridors, its files, its director, was hiding something far more insidious than the ghosts the locals still whisper about. Because what's more terrifying than the moans of the insane? The possibility that someone behind those locked doors wasn't insane at all, and that every word of those whispers was meant to be heard. England, 1905. Industrial smoke curled above brick chimneys like the breath of some vast, iron-beating beast. Trains screamed through the countryside, stitching the nation together while tearing it apart in the same motion. Cities ballooned into labyrinths of soot and desperation, and tucked just beyond them, in the wild stretches of moorland, institutions thrived. Asylums, palaces of mercy, they called them in pamphlets. Cathedrals of science, where madness could be studied, dissected, cured. But everyone knew the truth. Behind their high iron gates, they were cages. The public like to believe their lunatics were tucked safely away, humming into their porridge, rocked to sleep by the sound of their own restraints. Blackthorn Asylum was one of the crown jewels of the system. Established in 1841 and expanded in the 1870s, it's still like a medieval fortress with Victorian ambitions. Endless wards, barred windows, tiled corridors that smelled of bleach and despair. On stormy nights, the walls themselves seemed to groan, as though they could feel the weight of the secrets rotting inside. Doctors carried themselves like priests of a new religion, the cult of psychiatry. They preached that minds could be rewired, that illness could be mapped, classified, contained. But their treatments were not salvation. Ice baths, electroshocks, sensory deprivation, surgical experiments disguised as science. To be declared insane was to be condemned to a life where one's screams were cataloged, where pain itself was a form of research, and society applauded. Better the broken be locked away than seen wandering the streets. Families signed away sons who muttered to themselves, daughters who rebelled, wives who dared to resist their husbands. All fed to the same brick maw. By 1905, whispers about abuses in English asylums were surfacing. Inspectors hinting at overcrowding. Journals questioning whether the very act of confinement was driving patients deeper into madness. But Blackthorn was different. Its reputation was curiously spotless. No scandals, no exposés. In the official reports, it glowed as a model institution. Efficient, orderly, progressive. Yet those who lived near it told a different story. They spoke of carriages arriving at odd hours, carrying patients no one ever saw again. They spoke of lights burning in the administrative wing long after midnight, though only one man, the director, Dr. Lionel Hargrove, held the keys. They spoke of the silence, thick and unnatural, that fell over moors when the wind shifted toward the asylum's chimneys. England in 1905 prided itself on progress. But within Blackthorn's walls, progress felt less like healing and more like an experiment in control. It was the perfect stage for something sinister to be hidden in plain sight. At the center of Blackthorn's story stands a man who, on paper, should have been the very embodiment of progress, Dr. Lionel Hargrove. Born in 1862, son of a surgeon and a governess, he was groomed from childhood to ascend the professional ranks. At Cambridge, he was dazzling, scribbling papers on degeneracy and the heritable taint before most of his classmates could properly hold a scalpel. His colleagues described him as precise, aloof, and intolerant of mediocrity, the kind of man who could dissect a frog, a theory, or a colleague's reputation with equal cold efficiency. But outside the lecture halls, whispers always clung to him. He had a peculiar interest in spiritualism, though he dismissed seances as parlor tricks. Instead, he obsessed over the threshold between life and death, not the theological divide, but the biological one. When exactly did the mind dissolve? At what point did a thought cease to exist? Could madness be induced, prolonged, or harvested? In 1894, he assumed the directorship of Blackthorn Asylum, and within a year, the place began to change. He banned certain brutal treatments. Yes, ice baths, some forms of restraint, which earned him the praise of reformers. But he replaced them with something else, something quieter. New wards were built underground. Medical records began to vanish. Patients reassigned to categories that made little sense. Staff turnover skyrocketed. Yet every official report gleamed with numbers that promised order and improvement. Hargrove himself rarely appeared in the day wards. He preferred the private wings, where he selected patients for therapeutic trials. He believed, or at least claimed to, that certain minds could be mapped like constellations, that inside the ravings of the delusional lay patterns, threads of hidden logic. He would sit for hours with patients who muttered in fragments, scribbling notes furiously, as if decoding a secret text. And the patients he fixated on, well, they changed. Witnesses claimed they grew quieter, then stranger, as though someone else were speaking through them. They developed tics, repeating the same words over and over. Some lost their voices entirely. Others began to laugh at night, long after the lamps were dimmed, in perfect synchronization with each other. One attendant recalled seeing Hargrove in his office at dawn, staring at the wall as though listening to something only he could hear. On his desk, an open notebook filled with lines of near-identical phrases. They are here. They are here. They are here. The staff said nothing. He was a director. He was brilliant. And if his brilliance was touched by madness, then perhaps that was simply the price of genius. The strange part isn't that Dr. Hargrove studied madness. The strange part is that madness seemed to start studying him back. It started with a door, or rather, a door that wouldn't stay shut. In January 1905, attendants in Ward C began reporting that the padded cell at the end of the hall, a room reserved for violent outbursts, kept opening itself during the night. At first, it was dismissed as faulty hinges. The asylum was old, the wood swollen from damp, but when they checked, the lock was intact, the bolts firmly in place. Still, every morning the door yawned open, as if something inside had simply decided to leave. The cell's last occupant, a young woman named Margaret Sloane, had died months earlier. Her case was notorious among staff. A shopkeeper's daughter committed after claiming she could hear voices through the walls of her family's home. The coroner marked her death as respiratory collapse. Hargrove ordered her files sealed, unusual for a patient of no particular importance. Since then, the room had remained officially empty, but attendants swore they heard movement within it. Scratching, pacing, the sound of someone muttering against the padded walls. One night, when a nurse pressed her ear to the door, she staggered back white-faced, claiming she'd heard her own mother's voice calling from inside. Then came the diary, discovered beneath another patient's mattress. It contained frantic entries written in two distinct handwritings. The first belonged to the patient, whose erratic script described visions of figures standing in his room at night, watching silently. The second handwriting was colder, controlled, repeating the same line across several pages. She is not gone. She is waiting in the hollow. The patient denied ever writing it, and then, without warning, he tore out his tongue with his own hands and bled to death before attendants could reach him. The asylum's mood shifted. Patients grew restless. Staff began refusing to work the night shift in Ward C. Hargrove, unfazed, insisted the incidents be documented clinically. Hallucinations feeding hallucinations, he called it. Yet behind closed doors, he spent long hours in that cell. Witnesses saw him sitting cross-legged on the padded floor, notebook in hand, as though in conversation with someone unseen. The disturbances escalated. Lights flickered. Patients screamed at shadows no one else could see. A nurse reported hearing dozens of voices murmuring in perfect harmony through the air vents, though when others rushed to listen, there was nothing. And then, one night in February, a patient who hadn't spoken in 6 years suddenly rose from his bed, walked to the locked cell door, and whispered through the keyhole, "Doctor, they want you now." That was the night Blackthorn's routine cracked. What should have been dismissed as superstition began to feel like the unraveling of something vast, a script that had been written long before any of them arrived. By spring, Blackthorn felt less like an asylum and more like a stage where someone else was directing the play. The patients, once chaotic in their own peculiar rhythms, began to sink. Imagine a ward full of unconnected souls suddenly breathing in unison, muttering identical words like actors rehearsing lines. Attendants described waking at night to find patients standing silently at the foot of their beds, staring without blinking until dawn. The records from March 1905 are full of contradictions. Nurses scribbled panic notes about collective fits, yet the official reports filed by Hargrove described encouraging signs of improvement. Staff who raised concerns were dismissed as hysterical. A junior physician who attempted to resign was persuaded to stay after a closed-door meeting with Hargrove. The next day, he returned pale, mute, and compliant, and within a week, he'd stopped speaking altogether. His resignation letter was never found. Patients developed strange new habits. Some began sketching symbols, circles filled with jagged lines, crude diagrams that looked like maps of something subterranean. Others scraped their fingernails against the walls, tracing patterns into plaster that seemed meaningless, until someone realized the scratches were lining from cell to cell like fragments of a larger design. One nurse recalled seeing Margaret Sloane's name carved into the underside of a dining table, though no one admitted to doing it. Another swore she heard Margaret's laugh echoing down the ward, though the girl had been buried months before. When staff raised this to Hargrove, he told them bluntly, "Patients cling to memory like ivy to stone. It is natural for them to imitate the dead. But imitation doesn't explain what happened on April 12th. During evening rounds, several patients began chanting, low and guttural, in a language no one could identify. The chant built like a fever, spreading from ward to ward until the entire east wing reverberated with the same rhythm. The words were nonsense. At least they seemed nonsense, but when attendants tried to silence them, the patients fought back with a ferocity none had displayed before. The episode ended abruptly, as if cut short by an invisible hand. Silence swallowed the asylum. Patients slumped into catatonic stupors, drooling, shaking, unresponsive. Hours later, they snapped awake as though nothing had happened, and in his office, Hargrove recorded a single line in his private log, one later recovered in fragments by an inspector. "They're organizing." The whispers weren't just echoes of madness anymore. They were becoming structured, cohesive, intelligent. Blackthorn had ceased to be merely a prison for the insane. It had become something else entirely, a laboratory perhaps, or a hive. If you peel back the brittle pages of the county archives, you'll find them official inquiries that look like paperwork but smell faintly of panic. Local authorities have begun receiving complaints, not from patients' families. Those letters were routinely ignored, but from staff who fled Blackthorn and refused to return. A nurse named Agnes Fell wrote a desperate statement, claiming, "The patients are not ill, they are learning," before disappearing 2 weeks later on her way to the market. Her bicycle was found abandoned in a ditch. An inspector was dispatched in May 1905. His report survives, though heavily redacted. He noted disturbances inconsistent with medical explanation, wards and unnatural orderliness, and a curious refusal among patients to answer questions unless Hargrove was present. They would stare, stone-faced, until the doctor entered the room, at which point they would nod, smile faintly, and speak as though on cue. The inspector closed his report with a baffling line. "This place operates not as an asylum, but as a choir awaiting its conductor." Theories spread like mold. The skeptical claimed mass hysteria, a self-contained community, overworked and underfed, hallucinating together in the fevered dream of institutional life. Others muttered darker possibilities, occult rituals, spiritual possession, perhaps even experiments that blurred the line between psychology and sorcery. After all, Hargrove had corresponded with societies dabbling in both. Letters exchanged with the Society for Psychical Research, and stranger missives to individuals in France rumored to be practicing thought transference. And then there were the physical clues. Patients' carvings on the walls matched diagrams found in old alchemical texts, sigils meant to open conduits. A chapel Bible went missing, later discovered in the boiler room with its pages cut into strips and rearranged into something like an incantation. And yet, every time officials pressed for explanations, Hargrove's calm deflections erased suspicion. He was a gentleman, an academic. To accuse him outright of cult practices would have been unthinkable. But one detail refused to sit quietly. Several death certificates from that year listed causes so vague they bordered on fraudulent. Respiratory failure, collapse, exhaustion. The patients buried under those certificates, they had one thing in common. Each had been described in staff notes as excessively whispering. Were they silenced because they were dangerous, or because they were beginning to say too much? In the absence of proof, The case file was shelved. Theories remained theories, archived and dustbound. But the staff who remained inside Blackthorn knew there was no theory at all. Something was happening in those corridors, organized, deliberate, patient as a spider in the rafters. And whether it was Hargrove's hand or something whispering through him, the asylum had become a machine turning madness into something far more disciplined. The breaking point came on a night thick with storm clouds, when the asylum's lamps flickered and every locked door seemed to breathe. June 23, 1905. Attendants reported that the patients of Ward C began rising from their beds, one after another, as though responding to an unheard signal. No screaming, no chaos, just a slow, eerie procession toward the east wing. By the time staff realized what was happening, dozens had gathered outside the infamous padded cell, the one that refused to stay shut. Witnesses swore the patients stood there silently for over an hour, hands pressed flat against the door, foreheads resting against the wood. The thunder outside rattled the windows, and then, in perfect unison, they began to whisper, low, rhythmic, like prayer. Some attendants joined without knowing why, their own mouths shaping words they couldn't understand. When staff tried to intervene, the patients resisted with unnatural strength. Bones snapped, skin tore, but they didn't cry out. They simply kept whispering, and then the door opened. What was seen inside is contested, drowned in contradictions and terror. Some said the cell was empty except for Hargrove, sitting cross-legged in the center, eyes rolled back, blood trickling from his nose. Others insisted there was another figure in there, tall, indistinct, as though formed from shadow itself. The patients fell silent, every head bowing toward it. The incident report, of course, reduced the night to a riot. 4 patients dead, 2 staff injured. But those who survived told darker stories. A nurse, trembling and half delirious, claimed Hargrove had spoken in a voice that wasn't his own, promising that the hollow is ready. An attendant swore he saw the shadow slip from a room into the walls themselves. The asylum was sealed for 3 days afterward. No visitors, no inspectors. When it reopened, things appeared calm again. Too calm. Patients who had once screamed, raged, or wept now sat docile in their beds, staring at nothing. The carvings on the walls had been scrubbed away. And Dr. Lionel Hargrove? He resumed his duties as if nothing had happened. Though those close to him whispered, he looked thinner, paler, as though something had been drained from him. But the most disturbing shift was in his journals. Before June, his notes had been frantic, fevered, disjointed sketches and half-sentences. After June, his handwriting became steady, elegant, unervingly clear. And the words? They no longer read like the thoughts of a doctor. They read like instructions. On paper, Blackthorn's story ends neatly. By autumn of 1905, the official records show stability. Fewer deaths, fewer incidents, improved order. Inspectors found the wards quiet, the staff oddly content, the patients remarkably calm. If you flip through the ledgers, the asylum looks like a success story, a miracle of psychiatric discipline. But reality is never so tidy. Beneath the surface, a different narrative seeps through scraps of testimony, whispered rumors, and anomalies no bureaucrat could entirely bury. Why did entire families stop visiting their committed relatives as though worn away? Why did the parish priest resign after one midnight mass, refusing to ever set foot near the asylum again? And why, in late October, did Blackthorn suddenly transfer 30 patients to other institutions, none of whom survived more than a month after the move? The silence around Hargrove is most damning of all. His published articles dried up after 1905. No more lectures, no conference appearances. He rarely left the asylum grounds, as though tethered to them. Some said he had fallen ill. Others said he had simply lost interest in the outside world. But fragments of his journals, salvaged decades later, hint at something far stranger. The choir is tuned, the hollow widens. Their words are clearer each night. If the asylum was cured of chaos, was it really cured at all? Or had chaos simply been replaced with something organized, something collective, something worse? There is no definitive resolution. The archives closed like a slammed door. Hargrove remained director until his sudden death in 1911, found collapsed at his desk with his eyes wide open, mouth frozen in what some called a smile. The cause was written off as heart failure, but attendants swore his body stayed warm for hours longer than it should have, as though reluctant to let him go. And the whispers? Patients still spoke of them. Some claimed they came from the vents, others from beneath the floors. One particularly lucid woman insisted they came from the walls themselves, and that if you press your ear to the brick long enough, you could learn the words too. So what really happened in 1905? Did Hargrove crack the human mind wide open and unleash something he could never put back? Was it simply mass psychosis, feeding off a brilliant but broken director? Or, and this is a thought that gnaws like rats in the dark, did Blackthorn stop being an asylum and become something else? An amplifier, a doorway, a machine for turning the human mind into a vessel? And if so, whose whispers were they repeating? History has a cruel way of tidying up horrors. By the 1920s, Blackthorn Asylum was spoken of in respectable journals as a model institution, cited in lectures as an example of early psychiatric reform. The riots, the deaths, the whispers, all vanish in the narrative, reduced to growing pains in the march of progress. But in the cracks of that polished story, you find rot. Generations of former staff carried scars that never faded. A matron, retired in Devon, never slept without a Bible under her pillow and confessed on her deathbed that she still heard the choir whenever the wind howled. A ward attendant, drunk and broken, told his son that the patients weren't learning from us. We were learning from them. He slit his throat 2 weeks later. And then there's the ripple effect. Institutions across England began experimenting with group therapy, citing Blackthorn as precedent. Patients were gathered, encouraged to speak in unison, to chant affirmations together. The practice spread quietly, bolstered by glowing reports. But no one asked whether those sessions echoed what had taken place in Ward C, whether the unison wasn't healing, but infection. Even culturally, the legend clung. The nearby village told ghost stories of faces in asylum windows, of voices drifting across the moors. Children dared each other to shout questions at the broken walls, claiming the walls whispered back. During the Second World War, when troops were billeted near the asylum, soldiers reported unease so deep they preferred to bivouac in the rain rather than sleep beneath its roof. By the time Blackthorn was decommissioned in 1952, its reputation was untouchable on paper and unspeakable in reality. The building was left to rot, its files scattered into dusty archives. And yet, fragments of Hargrove's notes still surface, torn pages in private collections, scribbles in auction houses. Always the same phrases repeating, like echoes of that forgotten year. The hollow widens, the choir waits, listen closely. The legacy is not in medical textbooks, but in a strange, lingering fear that institutions don't merely contain madness. They can cultivate it, shape it, amplify it. That beneath the noble banners of science, we sometimes build cathedrals not for healing, but for something we dare not name. Blackthorn's story is less about one asylum and more about the way silence metastasizes. A scandal buried, a truth sealed, a generation trained to pretend nothing happened. But whispers are stubborn things. They pass through time the way they once passed through walls. And every time someone swears they hear voices in abandoned buildings, the question resurfaces, Are we haunted by the insane or by what was listening to them all along? Stand before the ruins of Blackthorn today and you'll see nothing but decay. Ivy strangled walls, shattered windows, corridors collapsed into rubble. Just another relic of Victorian cruelty, no different from the hundreds of other forgotten asylums that the countryside. But if you're foolish enough to linger, to let the silence wrap around you, the air feels thick, as though the building itself is listening. And maybe it is, because what if the real legacy of 1905 isn't the archives or the gravestones, but in the way sound carries, in the way words linger, in the way madness, once spoken, refuses to die? Whispers aren't loud. They don't demand. They invite. They coax. They seep into your mind like damp into plaster, quiet but unstoppable. Hargrove thought he was cataloging illness. But what if illness was cataloging him? What if the hollow he described wasn't a metaphor, but a structure, a space being built out of thought itself? If a choir learns to sing in unison long enough, does it matter whether there's a conductor, or does the music simply begin conducting itself? The horror of Blackthorn isn't blood, or chains, or even death. It's the idea that a group of broken minds might have brushed against something vast, and instead of recoiling, they harmonized. That somewhere beneath the floorboards of history, a chorus still hums, waiting for anyone, to press an ear to the walls. And maybe that's why the place hasn't been torn down, why it still stands, rotting but intact. You can destroy a body, but you can't kill a song once it's been taught. So if you ever pass Blackthorn on a windless night, and the silence feels too heavy, resist the urge to listen too closely. Because silence there isn't empty. It's full. And if you catch even a fragment of what's waiting in it, you might never stop hearing it. After all, a whisper isn't dangerous because it's quiet. It's dangerous because it makes you lean in. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.